Is it?
It's starting there. You want to close your thing now?
Which?
Just close the camera. And then camera not my way. So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm very excited to have Amarnath with us today. So just a little bit on. Can you hear me? Or? Can everybody hear me? Sorry, everybody, we're having a bit of technical problems.
Thanks for everyone for joining us. I hope people can hear me, and we're going to try to screen share some slides that I have so that we can switch back and forth. Just to give you a short introduction of what I'll be talking about, it'll be for close to a year now. We've been doing a project on Westerners who are traveling to Syria, but with also a focus on I guess broader kind of the movement to foreign fighting and so on. So people who fought in a variety of different conflicts, but of course Syria kind of took urgency at the moment with the numbers that we're seeing traveling overseas. So we'll be focusing a little bit on that today, and I'll kind of go quickly through the talk and hopefully move fairly quickly into the question period because I'm more interested in the questions that you guys have. So one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that even though we've had previous conflicts where a lot of foreign fighters have left to travel, the Syrian conflict is kind of a fundamental game changer. Even if you look at just the numbers involved, you're looking at thousands of people who've left from the Gulf states and quite a high number from Western countries as well. Unprecedented, even if you compare it to previous conflicts like Somalia or Chechnya or Bosnia or any of these conflicts. So Syria has, just in terms of the sheer kind of pull of it, has been quite large. One thing I would keep in mind also is when we're talking about foreign fighters, it's not really a monolithic block of any kind. We really do need to divide these fighters into several waves, and for the sake of kind of clarity, I've divided them into two waves here. But I think you really need to look at the kind of diversity of these foreign fighters. Initially in 2012 and so on, you had the kind of what I like to call the transnational activists, if you want to call them that, the earlier fighters who left to fight with the Free Syrian Army. And groups like that, which were primarily kind of nationalist in focused on the Assad regime, and not so much the kind of hardcore jihadists that we're seeing now. So the second wave probably started somewhere around mid-2013, really picked up in 2014, and these were, of course, the kind of post-caliphate travelers who left to fight on behalf of the Islamic State. So we've moved from a kind of defensive jihad, defending the Muslim community against the atrocities of Assad, to a kind of spread and defend and sustain the Islamic State framework. So just to keep in mind that not all foreign fighters throughout even the course of this conflict have been the same. And speaking of the Islamic State, of course, you do need to keep in mind the kind of state building approach that they take. One, this is the recent headline or the recent initiative that they put forth to establish a kind of Islamic State health service modeled very much on the National Health Service of the UK. And so they're pitching very much this idea that they're building a state, they're demolishing the past and building a kind of new utopian vision. So again, very much different than what we saw in the past when it came to fighters of previous iterations and so on. I'm not going to go too much into the history of ISIS, mainly because I think many people know it already. But in terms of, I've argued, and many other people have argued, that you can draw a fairly straight line between, from the invasion of Iraq in March 2003 to the rise of ISIS. And if you have questions on the kind of different iterations of the movement, we can talk about it during the question period. The other important thing, of course, is this issue of motivation. So what is driving these individuals to travel overseas? One thing I would stress is that in all of our conversations with fighters, particularly with the Islamic State, the idea of religious issues or the religious motivation is always front and center. But often when I say this or when others say this, it's often taken to mean that somehow we're blaming Islam, or somehow Islam is to blame for the Islamic State. And of course that's not true. But to ignore the kind of religious component or the religious discussion that happens within the Islamic State is also not entirely accurate. Yes, they may be misinterpreting. Yes, they may be not entirely aware of all of the debates within the tradition, but they very much want to position themselves as the kind of authentic actors when it comes to the religious worldview. The second thing that I want to focus a little bit on is this idea of the Islamic, the role of the internet, right? I think there's been a lot made on this issue of what is the role of the internet in all of this. And a few things to keep in mind, they use it just like we use it. It's not like we need an entirely new set of theoretical tools to understand why foreign fighters use these things, or even jihadists in Syria use these things. They use it to keep in touch with other fighters. They use it to keep in touch with their family, read news, and those kinds of things. The different issue, of course, is this idea of religious authority, where who do you actually go to if you have a religious question? Who do you actually go to get an idea of whether your view or things that you're reading are accurate? And this is where things start to get a little dicey, because you have this phenomenon that some people have called Sheikh Google, where anyone can Google anything, just like with medical issues or anything, and you actually start to get information that is fundamentally inaccurate or quite troublesome, and people start to act on these belief systems, which become problematic. The last one is, I think, the most important, but also the least studied and least understood, which is the idea of how the online community works, right? What does it actually mean to be part of an online community? And there, so in my conversations, for example, with several supporters and people who have supported the Islamic State, they often emphasize, I'm not going to read this entire quote, but they often emphasize the fact that they feel more more in line with who they really are when they're online. They feel like their online identity is much more important than their real identity, and the friends that they have online and on Twitter are much more significant than the people that they actually interact with on a day-to-day basis. So this idea of the online community, this notion of a family online, he says the Bakia Twitter family is the one place I felt at home, right? And I'll get into what that means in a second. But this idea of your online self being more authentic than the real self is something that is quite important here. So when it comes to the family, I guess, or the community of the online, the community that exists online, particularly with ISIS supporters, they call themselves the Bakia family. Bakia basically means enduring, but it's used as a kind of battle cry or a war cry with the Islamic State. And the inclusion in the family or your status in the family often has a lot to do with how often your Twitter account gets suspended and those kinds of things. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of how a lot of this stuff plays out. Their kind of identity in this family and their inclusion in this family is very much built around the wave of Twitter suspensions that they're a part of. So I think there's been this huge debate about Twitter accounts being suspended. Is it worthwhile? Is it effective? And I think this adds another kind of complexity to this situation, is what happens when the very suspension that you're advocating becomes a tool that's important for their own identity and how all of this functions. So I'll read a quote from an interview that I conducted with one of the supporters of the Islamic State. And he says, when the wave of mass Twitter suspension started, those who spread the truth or supported ISIS got suspended. So basically, those who had accounts suspended were considered trustful. Back in that time, everybody wanted to get suspended. Even I thought, must be cool to get suspended and receive all that support from friends. When I got suspended, lots of people were saying, welcome to the Bakia family. It is considered a kind of shahada. That's why we say, my Twitter account just got shahada, alhamdulillah. Suspensions show that we are in the right path, spreading the truth. Because the West doesn't want people to know the truth. You know how trustworthy an account is by the number of times it gets suspended. So if an account got suspended 10 times, you would know that that brother or sister spread beneficial tweets and trustworthy news. So this idea that the very inclusion, being a part of this online family is very much tied into what happens to your online self, what happens to your online Twitter account. is quite important for people's identity. So just to go quickly through some of the Canadians that we know about that have been reported online, there are a few that haven't been reported in the media who I won't be sharing, of course, but the ones that have been in the media are quite well known. From British Columbia, you do have Hazibullah Yousafzai, Jill Rosenberg, who's fighting with the Syrian Kurdish forces, and Suleiman, and another woman named Sadia, who's also, we suspect, in Syria at the moment. Then, of course, you have the much higher numbers from Alberta, the initial 5 who left from Calgary that everybody kind of knows about, and the others from the suspicion or the community rumor that there are at least 3 or 4 others who have left from Calgary, and then the quite high numbers that have left from Edmonton as well. One thing to keep in mind about Calgary, of course, is that this is a kind of key characteristic of how we study these things, because you realize very quickly that there is no real profile to these individuals. So even if you take Damien Claremont, who is the guy in the middle at the bottom, he was a high school dropout, was on medication, was homeless for a time, was a white convert, and then the guy next to him, Salman Ashrafi, was born into the faith. Was university educated, had a $100,000 paying job, had a wife and a kid, and they both kind of leave around the same time, right? So this idea that poverty somehow is the key, or mental illness somehow is the key, is sometimes true, but oftentimes it's not true either. So it's just in terms of trying to understand the profile and the motivations, it's something to keep in mind. I'll skip Manitoba for now. Ontario, also quite high numbers. Starting at the bottom, you have Ali Deary, who was part of the Toronto 18, and as soon as he was released from jail, went overseas and died. John McGuire from Ottawa, and at least 2 or 3 others from Ottawa, including Qatar Qalib and at least one other woman. So from Hamilton, you have Mohammed Mohammed, and right above him is Ahmed Wasim. Wasim is interesting because he actually came back to Canada in 2013 after being injured, was hit by shrapnel, and had a fairly severe injury, and came back to Windsor to recuperate. And the law enforcement kind of harassed him and harassed everyone around him, to the extent that he basically said, or told us later, that that's one of the main reasons why he left again. Of course, that's not entirely true, because he wanted to go back pretty badly, but I think that the kind of law enforcement detention and harassment is also a key point. And he died in March of this year. So I'll keep going. Quebec, initially Quebec wasn't on the map. You had the guys at the bottom there. The guy at the bottom is Jamal Abdel Kader. He's the first one to die in Syria in February 2013. And then Sami Alabi from right above there, who's fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra. And just in 2015 and late 2014, you had a kind of drastic increase of people leaving, from about 7 to 11 who have left, and closer to 12 who have left just in the last 6 months or so from Quebec. So initially not a whole lot, but now it's on the map. And then you have the kind of slew of Twitter accounts who we know nothing about, and all we have is the kind of their Twitter handle. We have a vague idea of who they might be, but not a whole lot in terms of in terms of who they are. The other thing, of course, is what I like to call the keyboard jihadis, people who are one second here. People who are kind of online at home with their families, and have an intention to leave, or maybe supporters, but actually not kind of the cheerleading squad, so to speak. But as I mentioned earlier, of course, the kind of community that they're involved in online is quite important, and is something that we should keep in mind. These kind of supporters are often dismissed as not entirely relevant or not entirely worth watching, but I think the opposite is actually true. So when it comes to Canadians, just a quick summary. So far, about 15 have been killed, 7 from Alberta, 7 from Ontario. and 5 converts, all men. The vast majority of individuals who have left are now fighting with the Islamic State, but a few are with Jabhat al-Nusra and lesser-known organizations like Jaish al-Mujahideen, but the vast majority are continue to be with the Islamic State. So just a quick word on the women and what their role is, I guess, in the Islamic State. They have a kind of you should, just like with the men, they have very elaborate online profiles. They're part of they have Tumblr accounts and Instagram feeds and Twitter accounts and so on. And they're you know, the woman on the far right there, Laith, she has her Tumblr account, which runs into the hundreds of pages, and has all kinds of advice about how to travel there, what to bring, what not to bring, and how to prepare for her journey and so on. So this little quote here is from her blog. It says, you know, bring makeup and jewelry from the West because trust me, there's absolutely nothing here. It's better for you to bring clothes and shoes from the West. There are clothes here, but wallahi, the quality is really bad. And so this, you know, it's like a travel log for individuals who want to travel to the Islamic State, right? And it's just pages and pages of advice on how to get here and what to tell your parents and what not to tell your parents and so on and so forth. There's been some speculation about whether women have fighting roles. Women currently with the Islamic State do not have any fighting roles. There's only 2 kind of brigades that come close. One is the Al-Khansa Brigade, and the al-Rayyan Brigade, who function basically as kind of religious police in the capital cities that Raqqa controls. I mean, ISIS controls, like Raqqa and other cities, where they, you know, do traffic duty, or they check women. They make sure that that women are practicing their outward appearances is in check, and those kinds of things. So the idea of there hasn't really been any idea, any sense that they're going to be involved in any battlefield frontline combat as of now. Their greater role is the kind of last one that's mentioned there, which is raising Mujahideen children, right? So just like with women in the First World War, who, you know, as the men went off to battle, the women were responsible for taking care of the home front. You have a very similar framework here, where the women are responsible for building the state, sustaining the state, protecting the state, and also kind of populating the state, or bringing the next generation of fighters into the state. And so Laith, for example, has a long quotation in her blog where she says, you know, imagine giving birth to a male in the Islamic State, and he goes on to fight in the Al-Malahim, right, the final battle. Imagine how proud you would be, and imagine how awesome it would be. And so it's that kind of rhetoric that I think is important for women, and their role as disseminators and kind of propagators in terms of the broader ideology is quite important. So just to conclude with this idea of the threat at home, of course it's been a bit overblown. I think, you know, given the numbers, we've only seen about 60 who have traveled overseas. And if you, I think with the RCMP numbers, you have somewhere between 200 to 300 who they're monitoring on any given day. And so one thing to keep in mind, of course, is the kind of rethinking of how terrorism is actually done in today's world, where you don't have what's known as the directed attack anymore. You don't have, you very rarely have, I should say, groups like Al-Qaeda thinking about funding and orchestrating an attack. What you have more often now is the kind of networked and inspired attackers. So you have people like Ahmed Rouleau or Michael Zihaf-Bibo in Canada, who are kind of inspired actors who have, as far as we know, virtually no actual connection with any organizational framework. They may have been in contact with some fighters with the Islamic State or something, but it's not a kind of official, directed, funded interaction or funded attack. The networked attackers, the best, I guess, recent example is what happened in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo shooting, where you had some kind of tangential connection with the attackers and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Not entirely directed attack, of course, but not exactly an inspired attack, where these guys do seem like they were over there training for a bit and then came back. And the broader kind of conversation, I guess, is what to do with returnees and what to do with people who want to come back. And again, I think we need to keep in mind that not all fighters are monolithic block of some kind. We need to ask the question of, when did they leave, who did they fight for, and why are they returning? And I think this could be quite important when it comes to figuring out how to work on prevention strategies or going forward. So, Peter Newman at the ICSR has a kind of neat little three Ds that he calls the dangerous ones, who for all intents and purposes should just be locked up. But then he says, there are a good chunk who will come back disturbed. And instead of taking a strictly law enforcement approach, you should probably get them some kind of medical help or psychological help. And then the disillusioned who, went to the Islamic State looking for utopia and found something very different, and are coming back, and they're not necessarily going to attack Canada. And again, a law enforcement approach for these kinds of individuals is probably not the right way to go. And in fact, they could be quite useful when you're using them for prevention efforts to talk to other youth and things like that. So I'll leave it there, but if you do have any questions, we can chat. Thanks.
Great. So thank you very much, Amar. Yeah. So just I guess we can. I'll start with a question. As I know, you recently had a chance to go to the refugee camps in Turkey, and some of the conversations that we had, we're talking about kind of this idea of the hijacked revolution, and sort of these foreign fighters who are coming. And I'm thinking of Michael Muhammad Knight's article that came out last year, of kind of these Westerners who are coming to save the Eastern, right? That kind of narrative, that heroic narrative. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any kind of insights that you've gotten in some of your interviews or some of the conversations that you had with people who are in the revolution, who are either part of the rebellion, right, that are experiencing, and some of their thoughts and their comments on their perspective on seeing these people coming from, the U.S., UK, Europe, Canada, and then joining their fight?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So we were in Turkey, and I did some interviews with many individuals who were part of the initial revolution. So people in March 2011 who kind of kickstarted the revolution, put their lives at risk, were arrested, were tortured, were questioned by the Assad regime, and now are kind of living as refugees not necessarily in camps, but living as refugees in Istanbul or in other major cities in Turkey. And I kind of asked, what do you feel happened to what you started in March 2011? And almost all of them basically said it's not necessarily the foreign fighters who are doing it, but it's the kind of, we started a very legitimate revolution against a brutal dictatorship, and it was basically hijacked by the jihadist movements, and they've come and kind of fractionalized and made the situation very messy, and so they grouped the foreign fighters and they grouped Canadians and Americans within that jihadi community, and rightly so. I don't think they need to be divided in any real sense. But I think the broader trend, of course, the broader sentiment is that what they started has been lost, and in 5 years from now, they're probably not going to recognize Syria or the kind of revolution they were hoping for.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation, and kind of thinking. I mean, we work in Project Communitas with a lot of young people across the country, and one of our big challenges is kind of how do we reach out to people who are like, hey, I want to go overseas. Hey, I want to go help the fight. Hey, I want to help the struggle, and sometimes sincerely, and sometimes with bad intentions, but kind of how do you think, what are some of your recommendations in terms of strategies, in terms of programming that you may have seen in other places, or you may have seen with people that you're talking to, in terms of, I don't want to call it de-radicalizing, but kind of taking that energy and bringing it for proactive activism or on the proactive civic engagement and so on?
Yeah. I mean, particularly for the first wave of fighters, I think they went to join a movement that the West supported, right? We funded and helped the Free Syrian Army and groups like that. So they were, when these guys later moved into different organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS, they were quite confused when the West started to call them terrorists and things like that. So they said, when I first left, you guys supported me, and now I'm a terrorist, and how does that work? And but in terms of prevention, I think. I think it is kind of giving people a positive way to address their grievances, address or find a way to address the kind of burning desire for social justice and involvement in politics that they feel is not possible in the West, right? Particularly when the West is also involved in this conflict in terms of foreign policy, in terms of its foreign policy decisions overseas. So I think there's a lot of anger at the hypocrisy, anger at the kind of double standards that are practiced. And so I think addressing that and finding another route, finding a way to contextualize that is quite important. And I think that broader dissatisfaction is part of the reason why they get drawn to these broader views that come from overseas and or even regular ISIS fighters who basically say that everyone around you is a sellout. They've sold out to the West. They want to assimilate. They don't really want to be Muslim. And so we're the ones who are more authentic, and we're the ones who are doing it in a real way, right? And I think addressing that is important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So Alicia Cummings actually has a question. So what are the discourses that members of ISIS are drawing upon to justify their stance? Is it the Quran, Hadith, or any other historical sources? Is that something that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of the above. I think they've pitched themselves as an authentic caliphate, which all Muslims need to submit to, and all Muslims need to leave their Western countries and come join and come help sustain and help protect. And so that comes from all of the above sources. And if you watch Twitter for just a day, you can see the kinds of things that they're citing and the kinds of hadith that they're propagating in terms of that argument. The key point to that argument is that they're reliving, I guess, an idealistic golden age from the past, right? So just like the Sahaba or the companions of the Prophet built a state, fought others in the protection of that state, we are doing the same thing. And so just like, I guess, all jihadists of the past, they take on that kind of utopian vision of kind of recreating a lost past. So that kind of thing becomes hard to prevent against, right? That kind of it becomes hard to argue with because you're not arguing from a common platform. You're not arguing from something that everyone agrees on. Like, for example, the dictatorship of Assad is a bad thing, or he's created a lot of damage. It's for the most part, it's something that a lot of people would agree on, and it's a platform on which you can build a conversation. Whereas a lot of these other ideological positions are hard to argue with in that sense.
Hold on, we have another question. So as we know, a lot of the youth are going down to work with aid organizations, as they say, not traveling to specifically join ISIS. Do we know or have any numbers in the camps, or who stays where and who goes forward? Is this something we can track in any way?
In which camps do you mean?
I'm thinking so they're asking and is there a travel guide that we can trace kind of the route towards getting closer to ISIS? Is that something that you've seen in the camps? I guess in a way they're asking.
Is there kind of evidence of ISIS giving advice on how to travel?
No, more like if I'm sorry, I just is there a way to phrase that question a little better? So do we know? So from what I understand, do we know how many people who are coming from abroad in the camps that are there for doing aid work and whatnot?
Oh, okay. This is the difficult part to decipher, because only Australia has made the entire region of Raqqa under ISIS control illegal to travel to, and so only Australia has done that. So if you're a Canadian and you say that you want to travel to Raqqa, which is under ISIS control, but you just want to work in the hospitals, or you just want to work as a taxi driver or something, but not actually give allegiance, not actually say an oath of allegiance to the Islamic State, that puts you in very interesting legal territory if you ever want to come back into Canada, because you haven't really joined a terrorist organization, but you're operating in a region that they control, and presumably with their permission and blessing. And so therefore it puts you in very tricky legal ground about, are you supporting a terrorist organization or are you not? The recent case of the Sudanese doctors who traveled into Syria, one of them being Canadian, kind of highlights this, right? It doesn't seem, and I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like he actually joined ISIS. I think he told a bunch of people that he was going to work at the hospital in Raqqa or help the Syrian civilians in ISIS-controlled territory, but in Syria. And so there's a whole bunch of kind of debate going on about what does that actually mean and what does that look like. Whereas only Australia has come out and said, I don't care if you join ISIS or not, to give allegiance or not, but if you go into ISIS-controlled areas, we're going to arrest you if you want to come back. So that becomes tricky, I guess, from a Canadian perspective about how to deal with. But in terms of actual numbers, there aren't a whole lot from Canada. I know of only one who's actually public. So not a whole lot of precise numbers there.
And I guess to add to that question, and maybe that's the way the question was initially understood, is you see a lot of people who initially want to go help in refugee camps, and it's something that they go to Turkey. Why are you going to Turkey? I'm going to do aid work. And then it's there that, in fact, the radicalization process, or the say, oh, I can actually do more if I cross the border. And in the sense of, like, you get there and you feel like you actually can't do much. That the only way is taking up arms.
There haven't been any evidence of that. I think there was more of that happening in the early days in 2011 and 12, where there are some cases of individuals who left, who went into Turkey, where much of the Free Syrian Army leadership was, helped them kind of with political organizing, and once in a while would go into Syria, do some fighting, do some training, and come out again. But we don't necessarily call the Free Syrian Army radicalized. We funded them for a long time, but I haven't seen a whole lot in terms of ISIS, people going to want to do aid work in Turkey, all of a sudden becoming ISIS supporters and traveling over. There are a lot of fighters in Turkey some who are injured, some who are there just kind of recuperating, hanging out on vacation. And I don't say that flippantly, like some are actually on vacation in Turkey. And if you get married in Syria, sometimes you are allowed to go to Turkey for a while. And so there's some evidence of that, but nothing in terms of traveling and then becoming radicalized in Turkey.
And I guess this is quite a big question, but so based on what you've seen in your research and sort of the progress that we've seen in the last 10 months that ISIS has been on the stage, on the world stage. Do we know how ISIS is supported financially?
They're one of the only groups that, for the most part, fund themselves. So they control quite a bit of oil resources in Iraq, which they sell through black markets to Egypt and Turkey. They are involved in the antiquities trade, so a lot of the idols that they're destroying and making a big deal about destroying and cleansing from society, they're actually selling through black markets to other countries. And so they make quite a bit of money that way. I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence that the Gulf states are actually funneling money to ISIS. This is a much longer answer, which we don't have time for, but it just doesn't make much sense. Of course, the Gulf states are very much funding other organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham and kind of non-ISIS jihadi movements, as well as the Free Syrian Army groups. But in terms of ISIS, I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence that the money is coming from any of these countries. There is some rumor, I guess, particularly during the Battle of Kobani, that Turkey was assisting ISIS by letting them across the border and attack the Kurdish forces from both sides and things like that, which I wouldn't be surprised if it was true, but again, it's hard to kind of verify, hard to prove. But I heard enough people kind of talking about it in Turkey, very close to Kobani, that it kind of rings true, and it makes sense if Turkey has a kind of long-running animosity with the PKK in Syria and in the Kurdish areas. So that part of it is not too surprising to me. But I think in terms of financial assistance, they're largely self-funded, and I mean they're good at it too. They took a lot from the banks and sell a lot of things to other countries. So I don't think they really need any outside help.
Great. So we're going to take a few more questions. So Dylan Robertson asks, isolation is a term that commonly comes up in media reports. How much does isolation play into the foreign fighter phenomenon?
I think, in terms of youth identity, I think it's quite important. We're still kind of researching many aspects of this, but for a good chunk of these youth, I think, they do come from somewhat troubled backgrounds in terms of family. Of course, the sample size is very small, so but they do seem to have come from somewhat broken families, or at least troubled families in a way, and often are reacting against that, find kind of identity in these broader movements and other movements. And then, of course, you have the convert issue, which the very process of conversion sometimes is deeply traumatic. They lose a lot of their friends that they grew up with. Their family doesn't accept them. I spoke to an American fighter once who said, my parents stormed into my bedroom and stole my Quran and took my Quran and told me I couldn't have it anymore and told me to stop being friends with my new Muslim brothers and sisters and that kind of stuff. So the very process of conversion sometimes is isolating in a way, and often the mosques that they're surrounded by aren't really equipped to deal with it or integrate them in any way. Sometimes they're ethnic mosques who all of a sudden automatically they're outsiders, cultural outsiders. And sometimes they're in a city that doesn't really have any mosques. So I spoke to one fighter from the U.S. who said, there is no mosque in my city, right? And so his entire identity, his entire Muslim interaction, his Muslim interaction was on Twitter. And so there are realities like that which I think need to be teased apart and understood much better. But under the broader category of isolation, I think it makes sense. Yeah.
And I guess a follow-up question to that is, community, by definition, would have a very important role in resolving a problem of isolation. How do you see, or what do you see the role of community in terms of creating programming that can bridge, say, ethnic divide or social divide or class divide?
It's a tough question because what do we mean by community, and how integrated are these communities to begin with? So I think, idealistically, yes, a strong community, a strong Muslim community is very important to identify these youth who are feeling increasingly isolated, and even to identify youth who are kind of start talking a certain way, start behaving a little differently, often isolate themselves from their friends from the past. Like we saw that in Calgary quite often, where Damien, but also others who initially had a group of friends, started hanging out with an entirely different group of friends, was isolated from the 8th and 8th Musalla, was isolated from different mosques. So you need a kind of integrated community to even notice stuff like that. You have some in places like London, Ontario, where it's close knit enough, I think, where you actually notice behaviors a little bit better. But there are places in Canada where someone can come to a mosque and never come again, and no one notices. And so I think kind of when you say community, that's what I think of. And I think the kind of healthy community in that sense is important for identifying and just often asking a youth who hasn't been to the mosque in a while, like, what's up, what's going on, haven't seen you in a while. That we think it happens often, but it doesn't really. So I think that kind of stuff is quite important.
Great. So I'm just going to ask viewers, we still have about 5-10 minutes. So if there's any questions, please feel free to share. Amar, I guess on that point, is there anything else that you feel you'd like to share, or some of the stories or insights, additional insights that you may have had, especially you're kind of obsessed with Twitter and you know that world. So is there something for, I guess, community members who are concerned but are also trying to find alternative ways to reach out to people, to create new counter narratives and so on? You mentioned a bit about that in your presentation, but do you have any additional remarks or insights?
I think just literacy is quite important, because I mean I've spoken to some religious leaders around the country who, when I tell them that almost all of the Canadians who are fighting in ISIS, quite a good chunk of Westerners who are fighting for ISIS are on Twitter, they are quite shocked, right, and quite surprised that that's even happening, or that's even a reality. So I think just the literacy of what their youth are doing on social media and how they're getting ideas from social media, and they may be bringing these ideas to the religious leaders, but they are not equipped to answer them, or they feel that it's not very important, and so they kind of dismiss them. That kind of stuff, I think, needs to change. And I think understanding where these ideas come from, understanding how these youth are talking online, and kind of being with one another, the friendships that are formed, the kind of deep personal bonds that are formed online. We don't think of it that way, but I mean, people are best friends online, right? And they've never met each other in real life, and so those kinds of bonds are quite powerful and deeply influential, and also deeply troubling at times. So. And I'm thinking of the Texas shooter and the kind of network that he was involved in, and he, a lot of people that he was friends with were kind of, ISIS supporters, Al Qaeda supporters, but they were generally, nice people, right? They were just everyday youth like any one of us, and he fit right in, and he also abandoned them quite readily when he had to go do something else, when he had to go. Felt like he had to go shoot up the cartoon event. So I think what happens online, I don't think many people really know enough, and particularly when you're talking about like a older religious leader and who may have never heard of Twitter, for them to kind of understand the issues affecting youth, I think, is a deep problem. And of course, that's not unique to the Muslim community by any stretch. I've heard the exact same conversation in the Hindu community or the Christian community, where the conversations and the rituals and the languages that are spoken in these religious institutions just don't resonate with the youth. And part of that, of course, is just a generational gap. But I think the kind of cross literacy is quite important, because if you're not watching Twitter and you want to understand your youth who are becoming radicalized, you're missing, I would say, at least 75% of what's going on. And that's not, I don't think that's an exaggeration.
I guess on that note, I'll ask you one more question.
Hmm.
So, is there anything you'd recommend for community members who want to become literate? Any literature that you'd recommend them reading, or any documentary, or any news reports, just so that people become more aware of, of this phenomenon, and especially the subtleties and nuances that are associated to the phenomenon we're speaking about.
The social media angle, or just the ISIS phenomenon?
Well, especially the social media, but also more on a wider level, the ISIS and foreign fighter phenomenon.
I mean, I think it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, there are some books out there. There are things you can read, but particularly with the social media angle, you kind of need to get your hands dirty a little bit and be with the Twitter and be with Facebook and see how things work, right? I mean, I've met religious leaders who don't know the difference between like a Facebook profile and a Facebook page or a Facebook group, or what a retweet is, or what a promoted account is, what a hashtag is, and so that it's not something that you can just read in an article. It's something that you have to kind of learn, and I think it's quite important, particularly if you want to tap into what the youth are talking about and what they're debating about online. In terms of the broader ISIS phenomenon, I think I've been kind of amazed by how much media attention it gets, and so I think what's covered in the media for the most part is at least factually correct. If the tone is even if the tone is a bit overblown, but at least the information on about what's going on the ground is quite out there pretty regularly. So.
Great. So on that note, we don't have any more questions. Oh, actually, one just came up. I guess we'll end on that.
Sure.
So do you have any ideas on approaches on how to prosecute the recruiters? So as we know, there are people in Canada who do recruit, and we've heard about them. But we know that they are protected on free speech and human rights. Proof and evidence is hard to get. Any talk about changing laws? Is that something that you've seen amongst policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I don't know. It depends what recruitment looks like, right? I think if we've seen some cases where people have been searched out, or people went looking to go to Syria and they've been offered financial assistance to get over there, and even kind of contacts to call when you're in Turkey to help you across the border and stuff like that. So that, for me, that's what recruitment looks like. But we often confuse recruitment with like convincing, right? So often when people come to the recruiter, they're already halfway to Syria mentally. It's not like the recruiter kind of convinces you to go or anything like that. I haven't seen too much evidence of that. One thing to keep in mind is a lot of this community stuff that I'm talking about online is kind of where the primary interaction is, right? Just like I can get in touch with a foreign fighter in Syria, many people who are interested in doing that can do the very, very same thing, and it takes about 10 seconds. It takes a Twitter account in about 10 seconds to be in direct communication with someone in Syria. So you actually don't need a flesh and blood recruiter on the ground in Canada. It's not absolutely necessary for what's the phenomenon that we're talking about. It's very easy to be in direct communication with one of these guys, and if they're trusting, one of these guys and girls, I should add, and if they trust you, they will often give you a contact information of a smuggler. They'll even arrange for someone to come pick you up in Istanbul and take you to the border cities. So it's not very difficult to find someone online who will help you. Having said that, of course, we've seen evidence, or at least some arrests having to do with possible recruiting. And I think those are pretty straightforward. If you're paying for someone to go overseas, if you're advocating that individuals join listed terrorist organizations, you're probably going to face some kind of legal action, particularly under the new legislation. If you're even promoting organizations that are listed in Canada, you might be visited by law enforcement. So I think yeah, I think that side of it, if there are flesh and blood people, they often leave a trace. They often leave financial or some kind of trail, which is often traced. But the online stuff, the kind of organic, nonchalant online recruiting is what I think we understand least about, and it actually happens much more often than any flesh and blood stuff on the ground here. So.
Great. So, well, thank you very much. It was very, very insightful, and just so the viewers know that the webinar will be recorded. So, if ever you want to refer back to it or share with your network, please feel free to do so. Amar, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It was very insightful, and I hope that the people who joined us benefited from it.
Thanks.